Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and our Footsteps in the Pacific week. And we were in Guadalcanal yesterday, and we are returning to Guadalcanal today, although we are going to be talking about some of the other campaigns before and afterwards. And we've tackled the subject of war correspondence a couple of times before, and it's just an interesting subject because these are people in the front line seeing the same actions that the infantry or the engineers are seeing, but they're writing about it rather than participating. And this particular gentleman we're talking about tonight went through 3 wars: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. You can only imagine how different that was, reporting from those 3 wars. So my guest today, Ray Boomhower, is a kind of prolific author, over a dozen books. He's written about presidents and astronauts and potential politicians and World War II and reporters, and I'm delighted to have him. So without further ado, I'll introduce Ray Boomhower to the show. So good afternoon, Ray. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Paul. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about an individual I find particularly fascinating.
Well, you've led it. Thank you. Welcome to the show. You've led into my first question there, because as I said there at the top of the show, you've written about all aspects of things with an Indiana focus, because that's where you're from. But, you know, when you get to a certain point and you've done a few books, how do you find the next subject? What drew you to this story?
I'm drawn by my interest in 2 things, journalism and also World War II. I started out life trained as a reporter, and I worked for a couple of Indiana newspapers before I turned my talents to the field of history and also writing and biography and about also Indiana people of note. But I was trained as a journalist at Indiana University in Bloomington. And the journalism department, when I went to IU, was in Ernie Pyle Hall in Bloomington.
Right.
So Ernie Pyle was someone that featured quite a bit in my early journalism career, and I became fascinated by him. And I was lucky enough to write a youth biography about his career, including his time in World War II for the Indiana Historical Society Press. And that led me to think, well, I should write about another World War II correspondent. And I went outside the confines of Indiana for the next subject, and that was Robert Sherrod, whose 113th birthday is today. So happy birthday to the late Robert Sherrod, who wrote for Time and Life magazine during World War II. And he was kind of the Ernie Pyle of the Marines. He followed the Marines across the Central Pacific, including the Battle of Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. So I was able to write about his time in the Pacific. So I thought, well, I should do a trilogy. I should do a trilogy of war correspondents. So who's someone else I could write about? And I had read Richard Tregaskis' classic book of World War II, Guadalcanal Diary, when I was in high school. So I had known about him. I thought, well, he's someone who might fit the bill for this trilogy I'm writing. And then I learned that he and I shared the same birth date, November 28th. So I thought, well, fate's taking a hand.
That's a bit of fate there.
He's the one I should concentrate on. So I decided to write about him about 3 years ago. And the book was finally published in November of last year.
Wow. And of course, folks, the links to the book are in the description below. And as usual, I recommend you go out and have a look at it. So the thing about journalists, before we get into your presentation, journalists by nature, reporters have by definition have a flair of writing and telling stories. That's their day job. So when you're researching someone who has written about the war and perhaps written about themselves, now Ernie Pyle, of course, didn't survive the war.
Right.
Do you find sometimes in the cases that they embellish a little bit, their storytelling expertise kind of carries over into how they describe their own events, and you have to kind of wade through the kind of flowery way they've written about things to kind of get to the truth?
There's always that danger that they might have exaggerated some of their accomplishments during the war, but I was lucky enough to pick 3 people who are known for being accurate and being very determined to report what they only saw themselves while they were on the front lines. Sherrod mentioned when he was doing his work in the Pacific that he and other correspondents always wanted to do a good job, did not want to be seen as what he called communique commandos, those who stayed behind the front lines back at headquarters and just wrote from the canned handouts issued by the public relations officers in the military. They wanted to go out front, see for themselves what was going on. And I think that's something that comes through in the writing of Pyle, Sherrod, and Tregaskis. And they were well known for that. They made sure that they only reported on what they saw firsthand. And they became beloved for doing so by those who were on the front lines actually doing the fighting.
Well, that makes a very good point. I'm sure it'll come up later in the presentation, is that I guess any journalist could hop into a war zone, spend a few weeks there, come out and make anything up they want to and sell it the way they want to do it, spin it the way they want to. But if you want to earn the respect of those guys who are on the ground who don't have the benefit of being able to go back and file their reports and have a cup of coffee away from the front line, and
Right.
then you've got to earn their respect. And the three people you've written about would have had to have earned that respect, so that when you go back to the unit again, they may have read your previous report. They may have seen what you, and if you've been flowering it all up and changing it all, they're not going to welcome you there into their metaphorical and literal foxholes there. So being honest and being genuine clearly was the way to go. That's how you earn the respect of the guys in the combat. But we'll begin the presentation. So, folks, if you've got questions, you know the score, fire away, and we'll deal with them as we go along. And Ray's got his presentation up that he'll be controlling, but I'll load it up on screen now. But basically, over to you, folks. So this is an insight into Reporter. We're not necessarily talking about which company was approaching on which flank, moving up which beat. This is about reporting the war, and I'm very, very appreciative that Ray is going to share his knowledge about that side of it. So over to you then, Ray.
Yeah, a little bit of background on Tregaskis and how he got to the Pacific. Of course, he was there on August 7th, 1942, with the approximately 11,000 men of the 1st Marine Division as they made their landings on an island in the Solomons named Guadalcanal. And he was only one of 2 civilian reporters who were there for the initial landings by the Marines. It was Tregaskis of the International News Service and Bob Miller of the United Press. They were the only 2 civilian reporters for most of the first month of the time on Guadalcanal. Later on, and when it came into early September, they were joined by other reporters as well. But they were there. They were only 2, civilian witnesses to the fierce battles that were going on between the Marines and the Japanese. But Tregaskis was only 25 when he started out his career as a war correspondent for the INS. But he had seen some action before going to Guadalcanal. He had been trained as a journalist early on in his life. He had earned a kind of a side living writing newspaper articles while he was at a private school growing up in Elizabeth, New Jersey. When he went to Harvard, he wrote about activities at Harvard for the local Boston newspapers. And he has a little interesting side during his time at Harvard. He was on the swimming team. And he just happened to beat out for the last place as a backstroker on the team a young student named John F. Kennedy. So he has that connection with the Kennedy family. So after graduation, he got a job with the Boston newspapers, worked there for several years. And in 1941, got a job with the International News Service, which is a news service agency. It's kind of the poor third child among news services at the time. At the top, you had the Associated Press, which had all the resources they needed to cover anything across the world. Next to them was the United Press, and then coming up in the rear was the INS. Bob Considine, who was a longtime INS reporter, said that when he went off to an assignment, he often went to a news breaking place, and there might be 10 to 15 AP reporters covering every aspect of the story. Then maybe half of that for the United Press, and he'd be the lone INS representative on the scene. So when he got the job with the International News Service, Tregaskis really wanted to go overseas and even spent some time trying to learn Portuguese because he thought he could become a foreign correspondent before the war broke out and INS would send them to Brazil. But with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, INS decided that they would offer him two opportunities, either Australia or England. And Tregaskis decided on Australia and was sent to overseas to report on the war in the Pacific. By the time he got to Hawaii, the INS decided he should stay there and report on Pacific Fleet operations. I will say that Tregaskis was operating under a handicap that other war correspondents were not during his time overseas, both in the Pacific and later on in Europe and then back to the Pacific. And that shortly during his time on the INS, he learned from his family's doctor that he was suffering from a family illness, diabetes, an illness that killed his grandfather and also afflicted his father and caused his death later on. So while he's trying to learn this new trade of being a war correspondent, he's also having to deal with the debilitating illness. Insulin was available to control diabetes at that time, but Tregaskis during World War II did not take insulin shots. He tried to control his illness through diet. So you have to avoid carbohydrates and make sure his blood sugar was at its proper level. And so as he's going to the Pacific, he's carting along with him a case of canned sardines to be able to eat when he goes on these assignments with the Pacific Fleet.
Now that shows some dedication, Ray, because, you know, we all know soldiers, Marines, you get what you're given in terms of food, and some of these hostile, barren places going to, you know, the diet is the first thing that went out the window. There's not even enough drinking water in some of these places. So that's, exactly. You know, I'm not saying it's kind of Medal of Honor worthy, but it's quite a bold move to go out into a war zone when you have a debilitating disease that's manageable, but it's manageable if you can, as you say, control your diet. But if you're in a situation where, you know, excuse me, sir, can I have a, you know, less sugar, more sugar? That's interesting. And I just, again, before I let you carry on, in his 20s, you know, do we know anything about what his kind of aspirations were in terms of kind of forging a style or a way of reporting? Because, you know, Ernie Pyle have been doing it for a long time. You know, if you're Tregaskis' age, you know, does he want to be kind of the man on the spot? Does he want to have a new angle? What's his kind of ambition when he you know, he's on that boat to Australia, do you think?
I think he's someone who really wants to report on what the soldiers were experiencing themselves. He was someone who was very gung-ho and actually wanted to be in the service, but was turned down by the draft because of his eyesight. And also, as you can see here, he's particularly tall. He's
just came up in
over
the sidebar.
Over 6'5" and he didn't meet the height requirements. And people kidded him when he was sent overseas that the Japanese would capture him and use him as an observation post. But luckily, that did not happen. So he wants to go overseas and do his part for the war effort, which was a big part, I think, of any correspondent who went overseas to kind of embed with the troops before that phrase was even known. You know, Tregaskis, Pyle, and the others are the original embedded reporters.
We said we before we went live, we'd talk about the aspect about that era was the journalists, the correspondents, photographers, they thought they were part of the war effort. They were there to report the war, but also to help with that propaganda, to be part of the images back home. And that's the interesting thing over the years, recent years, I think of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I've got friends who've been journalists there. Some of them are out there to make their name. Some of them are there to get a scandal, to find a story, to make people look bad. I think this generation was more about how can I do my bit? I'm good at writing. That's the way I should put my skills to use for the war effort. I could be driving a tank. I could be a paratrooper. My skill is writing. That's what I'll go and do. And when we get later on, I know it's beyond the World War II TV scope, but going to Vietnam, you know, 30 years later, very, very different war, very, very different reaction to it. So, but that in that era in the 40s, folks, you know, these journalists were just as patriotic, just as fervent to do their bit for their country, I think, as the Marines themselves.
And if you look at the journalists and their writings during the time and they're reflecting on this period, there's really two kinds of censorship going on. There's a self-censorship among the reporters who knew what they could and could not write. There's a great big thing called the war effort, John Steinbeck said, and everyone knew what you could write about and what you could get away with in your dispatches and what you couldn't. And then, of course, all the dispatches that were sent from war zones back to the home offices in the United States were censored at the scene by military officers. And then in Tregaskis' case back at Fleet Headquarters in Honolulu, before they were sent to the INS office for distribution to newspapers across the country. Another aspect of his life, too, is that most people on the home front are getting their information about the progress of the war from people like Tregaskis and Pyle. There might be some radio broadcasts, of course, but they're really looking for the day-to-day movement of the wars and the armies across the globe from the dispatches sent back by people like Tregaskis. And, his diabetes was something that he tried to keep a secret. He didn't let his employers know about it before he was sent overseas. And he kept that aspect of his life hidden from his fellow reporters as well. He had along this kind of a guidebook by an expert on diabetes, a doctor, and he had even forged in the book an autograph from the doctor. And he's saying that, well, I'm just carrying this because this guy was a friend of mine, not because I really need it. But even Bob Considine, who was going off on one of the missions with him, noticed the fact that he brought along, this case of sardines and wondered what was going on and wondered what kind of strange appetite this young reporter had. And that first mission was really an interesting one. Tregaskis was on the task force of the Doolittle Raiders. So his very first assignment with the Pacific Fleet was going along. He was on the USS Northampton, a cruiser that accompanied the Hornet as it sent the Doolittle raid against Tokyo. And quite an assignment, first assignment if you're a young rookie war correspondent. But as we mentioned, censorship rears its ugly head again. This is a secret mission. Even President Roosevelt, when he's asked about it, said that the bombers, came from Shangri-La, this James Hilton, novel and later movie, this fictional land. And so he gets back to Honolulu, Tregaskis does, and his dispatches aren't sent. They're just kept, and they don't really appear in a kind of a diary format until a year later, so long after his exploits in Guadalcanal. And for his second mission, he transfers from the Northampton to the USS Hornet, which had launched the Doolittle bombers. And he's there on it during the Coral Sea, which the Hornet does not participate on, but he's on it for the big turning point in the war in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. And one of the interesting aspects about Tregaskis was his ability to connect with those doing the fighting. He really did that, I think, on the Hornet with an ill-fated squadron that a lot of people who know the Pacific War have probably heard about. That's John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet that took off during the battle and was just decimated by the Japanese, with only one person from that squadron, Ensign George Gay, surviving. So Tregaskis is on the Hornet during this essential battle in the war in the Pacific. Experiences loss. He made good friends with the members of the Torpedo Squadron, and he sits down at dinner and notices all these empty chairs that were these people he had come to know and respect are no longer there to fill those chairs. And he sees death firsthand. At the end of the battle, the Yorktown is sunk, and some of its flyers have to land on other carriers. One of them, a young ensign, tries to land on the Hornet, His landing gear collapses. There's something wrong with the safety mechanisms on his gun. They start firing as he's crashing, and some of the Hornet crew are killed because of this accident. So Tregaskis sees the horrors and the accidents sometimes that cause casualties during wartime. While he was on the Northampton, Tregaskis got a bit of an early clue about where his future reporting would come from. He was talking to Admiral Raymond Spruance on the Northampton. They were talking about what the future of the war would bring in the Pacific. And Spruance goes to a map and kind of casually holds his hand over the Solomon Islands, and Tregaskis kind of sees it kind of hover over an island named Guadalcanal. So he kind of gets this clue from Spruance about what's going to be going on next. So when they get back to Honolulu after the Battle of Midway, Tregaskis goes to Waldo Drake, who's the head of the PR office for the Pacific Fleet, and says, I want to be sure to be on. If any kind of landing operation is going to be going on, put me on it. Drake is kind of puzzled, but says he'll do that. And Tregaskis gets a seat for the Battle of Guadalcanal.
And do you think, just to interrupt, that he'd had that experience on the Hornet and the Northampton, what have you, and so he has those moments of seeing pilots come back, or in that case, not come back. But there'd also be lots of downtime, lots of just chugging along in between battles. And I guess for a young person like he was, you're kind of going to be twiddling your thumbs a little bit in between those moments of high drama. So I'm sensing that there's this a bit of a desire to get in and be more continually in the front line. So you got a bit of a buzz of daily activity. Do you think that comes into it?
It comes in a lot. He's warned early on when he gets on the Northampton that there will be long periods of inactivity, and you got to get used to that if you're going to be in the Pacific. It's just the great distances involved in getting anywhere on a ship or even on a plane is just going to eat at you, and you're going to get bored. And he sees that with the Hornet's pilots, with their reading material. They pass from hand to hand and read novels and magazines over and over again because there's no fresh material for them to draw upon. And that's something he has to get used to as a war correspondent. Also, there's always this great unknown of are my dispatches to making it back? Communication is haphazard at the time. When he was on the Hornet, he had to make 5 copies of his article about the Battle of Midway and get it on a ship that's going back to Honolulu. He's not sure if that ship might make it, if his dispatches just might never see the light of day. So he also sends another 5 copies on another ship. And then he has to deal with the censorship from the fleet headquarters in Honolulu. And sometimes he says it's kind of like writing for yourself, because you never really know when you're stuck in the Pacific. You don't see the eventual results of your writing that actually appear in newspapers across the United States.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So he's on Guadalcanal and is there for the 7 weeks from August 7th until late in September. And he just has this knack, Tregaskis does, for being where the action is. And he has quite a lot of luck while he's on Guadalcanal. Of course, they're being shelled at all times by the Japanese ships offshore. There are air raids from time to time, and he and the other correspondents have to take cover and endure all this bombing. And they develop a kind of a sixth sense, knowing, when a shelling is going to come, when a bombing is going to come, and how to hide and get into the dugouts to take shelter. He was transported to Guadalcanal on the American Legion. That's where he first really got to meet and know the Marines, who were young men, very enthusiastic about testing their mettle against the Japanese. And one of the interesting aspects I found in rereading Guadalcanal Diary is some of the bravado shown by the Marines, and the fact that some of their offhand remarks were able to be passed by the censor because, well, he's on the American Legion. The Marines are sharpening their bayonets. They're talking about, getting a necklace of Japanese ears they would collect while they were on Guadalcanal. And that's something you don't really think of during the time if you're on the home front during World War II. You see that kind of starkness in reporting from correspondents overseas. He was there for some of the early awful and really hazardous fighting along the Battle of the Tenuera. He hears the action, goes there the next day, and is there when there's a Stuart tank counterattack, and sees these tanks running down and shooting down the Japanese attackers. And he's really isn't too concerned about seeing dead Japanese bodies. Dead Marines are quite another thing, but he says as you see them over and over again, you kind of come inured to the horrors of war. He's able to hook on. Tregaskis is he very able to connect with people of action, and early on he makes a connection with the leader of the Marine Raiders, Merritt Red Mike Edson, and he called him one of the bravest, most effective killing machines he ever encountered during his time in covering war. And he's trusted enough by Edson to accompany the Raiders on a variety of missions. They go to Savo Island on a reconnaissance, and Tregaskis and Miller go with them. They don't find any Japanese. They come back, and in early September, Tregaskis and Miller accompany the Raiders on the famous Tassimbaco raid. I don't know if I'm pronouncing
and
that
just to
right.
interrupt, folks, we talked about this last night with Dave Holland.
Yeah.
So if you want to have more of an understanding of the purpose of these raids and the combat element, this show dovetails very nicely with yesterday's show. So that just to inform you on that, folks. And so this is someone who was there in all these pivotal engagements that we've already talked about. So brilliant stuff, Ray.
And he's able, and he plays an important role in this raid, and that Tregaskis is there, and as they're going through all the various Japanese equipment and food and medicine that they find, he comes across a Japanese hut and gathers up all this kind of material, maps and documents, and puts it all in a Japanese blanket, and takes it back with him, and it happens to be very valuable information about a planned Japanese attack, the famous Battle of Edson's Ridge, or a Bloody Ridge.
And I wanted to stop at that point there, because this to me is indicating that a correspondent is viewing his surroundings differently to a guy who's in combat. The guy in combat is primarily trying to stay alive, and then secondly, trying to get his job done, which is killing the enemy. So he's looking for places to dive for cover. He's looking for potential threats. He's looking at, is there a sniper behind that tree? Is that body over there booby trapped? A journalist, a correspondent, has that instinct to kind of drawn to stories and also draw to paperwork. So, when he sees these bundles of files, obviously in Japanese, we had to read them. They could have been nothing, but I think that's a real good insight into the way someone who's slightly detached from the battle, although there, can see the battlefield.
Exactly. Also, one aspect of, if you're a war correspondent in the Pacific or in Europe, you're under certain guidelines established by the War Department. One thing, you have to submit, of course, all your articles to be censored by the military. You're given certain attributes. You're treated as an officer, so you can go to the officers club, and you're transported for free by the military to your assignments. Also, you're not supposed to carry any weapons. You're a non-combatant, supposedly. And so that means you're not supposed to carry weapons into battle. But that is kind of iffy during some aspects of World War II. Andy Rooney, who's a war correspondent for Stars and Stripes early on in the Air War, the 8th Air Force, he accompanies, along with Walter Cronkite and other reporters, including Bob Post, who doesn't come back, an air raid against Germany. And before they go, they're actually trained to fire the machine guns on the B-17 and B-24 bombers, because they were seen as someone, hey, we need you to get in there and actually man these guns if something happens. And on Guadalcanal, of course, Japanese don't see a non-combatant. They don't see Bob Miller and Tregaskis and the others as some people they're not going to fire upon. They're just another American there who they're trying to kill. And so both Miller and Tregaskis carried 45 pistols with them while they were on Guadalcanal. That might have been against the rules, but it's something that they saw as valuable for keeping themselves alive when they might be fired upon by Japanese snipers when they're on Guadalcanal. Here's Tregaskis with General Van de Greft. Near the end of Tregaskis' time on Guadalcanal. This is probably the end of September, and by this time, his combat boots had worn away, and he had to take on a pair of sneakers to traipse around the jungle. He had size 14 feet, which the quartermaster were in horror about, just trying to supply him with any kind of new footwear. So that's one of the reasons he decided that it might be time for him to leave. He'd always had this gnawing ambition to write a book about his experiences on Guadalcanal. He had taken careful notes during his time there. He had these small notebooks that he wrote things down with during the day when he was out and about on the island. And then later on at night, he had this big black heavy notebook that he put all these notes into, and so that he could turn to these when he decided to write his book about Guadalcanal. So he leaves on September 26th and takes a B-17 to New Caledonia eventually, where he's there kind of going through the red tape it would take to get him back to Honolulu, where he could finish his book. He's writing during his few weeks on New Caledonia. But he finds that, his experiences on Guadalcanal did have an impact on him. He talked about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's a long-term thing that comes from being in combat. But even on New Caledonia, after his 7 weeks with the Marines, Tregaskis get these feelings, any kind of loud noise or anything like that, that might, he think be shell fire, the experience on Guadalcanal. He's always on edge, even as he's trying to write about his experiences on Guadalcanal.
And I would imagine, Ray, there's an element of guilt as well, in that he has left before some of the guys he'd spent time with were able to leave. That's a Marine goes where he's told, and
Right.
But a journalist can just walk back. They can just go back to the headquarters, go back to beach, take a breather. And in his case, leaving in September, as we know, there was still fighting in October.
Still going on. The
So,
outcome is still in doubt, even during that time. Even though things had improved greatly during the 7 weeks there, the issue was still in doubt, and so he had that gnawing away at him as well.
Yeah.
So he gets back to Honolulu and completes writing his book. So he gets back and spends most of October writing Guadalcanal Diary at Fleet Headquarters. He had to go to Fleet Headquarters because the material he brought back with him, including his jottings about the Doolittle raid, the Battle of Midway, and now the Battle of Guadalcanal, were deemed too secret to risk having out and about. So he'd have to go to Fleet Headquarters during the day, write, and they would lock it up in a safe overnight. And actually, those notebooks were never returned to him. So his big black notebook that he based Guadalcanal Diary is lost somewhere to history. So he completes writing his manuscript and sends it off to INS headquarters to his boss, Barry Ferris. He's the short gentleman in the glasses on the right there with the Sea Correspondent armband, somewhere in the Pacific, sharing some beer with Tregaskis. So Tregaskis sends his book, agrees to split the profits 50-50 with his employer, and Ferris promised him they'll make every effort to get his book published. So what they do is they send it off to 9 different New York publishing firms saying, okay, you can bid on the opportunity to publish this book. And Bennett Cerf, who's one of the founders of Random House, a very important New York publishing firm, even today, takes one look at this, has it, gets the manuscript on November 11th, takes it back with him, reads it that night, and the next morning calls up INS and says, we've got to have this book. He realized that the first book about Guadalcanal would probably become a bestseller because people were just fascinated by that battle, the pitched battle between the Marines and the Japanese. And the first person to do a book about that would probably have a bestseller on their hands. So he accepts the manuscript. And by January 18th, 1943, the book is published and out and becomes a bestseller and is later turned into a film under the same name, Guadalcanal Diary. But it's amazing achievement during wartime. Just think of how fast that book was published.
Yeah.
Tregaskis sends it off in early November, and by the middle of January, it's in readers' hands as a Book of the Month Club selection, and becomes one of the classics from World War II.
And I wanted to sort of jump in again here because it still holds up. I have a copy of it somewhere on my shelf in the other room, and some books that came out in the war by definition end up being heavily influenced by the censors. There's a propaganda message there that can be a little bit kind of clunky when you read back at it later on. And we've got Henry Sledge joining us again tomorrow talking about his father's journey across Peleliu. So he was writing a couple of decades after war and beyond, when you can reveal the visceral nature of it. You can be a bit more gory about what you went through and the experiences. Guadalcanal, I can't say it now. Guadalcanal Diary comes out very early. It is pretty raw. It's obviously there's a little bit of kind of smoothing out of some of the real horrific events, and then a movie within months. It must hold records from the writing, publication, movie, all in a matter of months. And if you haven't seen Guadalcanal, I can't say again. That's 3 times I've tripped over the word now. If you haven't seen the film, folks, go and watch it. It's fantastic. One of early role for Anthony Quinn, Richard Jacob, Preston Fotcher, Lloyd Nolan. It's a great film. And how would that sudden international fame affect Richard? I mean, you've been a jobbing journalist who's not even sure that your reports are getting from ship to back to head, and suddenly your book's gone viral, we would say today. So how did he deal with that aspect of it, the newfound fame?
Well, it's pretty easy for him to deal with because he didn't experience any of it, really. While this is going on, while he's becoming famous for his book, he goes back. He goes back to Guadalcanal to report on what was going on there, and is there when the victory is finally declared on February 9th, 1943. He goes there and instead of going actually into the jungle again, takes a ride on a variety of B-17 bombing missions against Japanese bases. And from there, you would think he finally gets word, that your book is a hit, finally gets a copy and is very pleased about it. But he's not there, going around the country giving talks or signing books at bookstores.
He's not going on Oprah.
No, he's not going on any of that. He goes back to the action and goes on B-17 bombing missions against Japanese air bases, evening, daylight and nighttime bombing missions, and is also there for the next operation, which is Operation Clean Slate. The occupation of the Russell Islands, which are located about 30 miles northwest, I think, of Guadalcanal. He's there instead of with the Marines, he's with the Army's 43rd Infantry Division. Finds that they're a little bit older, a little less brash than the Marines. And luckily for him and the Army members, the occupation of the Russells are unopposed by any Japanese opposition. So finally, in April 1943, Tregaskis is able to return to the United States. He had been very lucky on Guadalcanal, of course, in the Russell Islands. As I mentioned before, he has a lot of near misses in action when he's accompanying the raiders on that mission against Savile Island. They're transported there by two former World War I destroyers, I think the Gregory and the Little. They are fast transports. They were converted from World War I destroyers. And they're brought back to Guadalcanal. And then there's a little question about, should we stay on board for another operation or should we get off? Well, they decide to disembark. And that evening, Japanese destroyers come by and sink both of those American ships. And so he came very close to dying in that when he was on that Tashambuco raid. There's a little Yippee boat, a little patrol boat. It was a converted tuna boat that he was on for that mission. And when he gets off it, it's later sunk by the Japanese. He's almost caught up early on during his days on Guadalcanal. He's going across to Toluga to report on the action there, all the fighting on those small islands near Guadalcanal. And he's on this landing boat, and they're set upon by a Japanese submarine. Finally, the fire from Toluga drives off the submarine, but he escapes once again. He did pick up some stomach disorders that put him in the hospital for a few days while he was on Guadalcanal, and also picks up some malaria. So while he's back in the United States, he decides that he's going to transfer to the European theater and doesn't want to be, left behind, and decides that, well, I might as well recuperate from malaria while I'm in England. So he goes overseas to England and recuperates from his bout of malaria and is able to be there for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. So he's switching from one theater to another, which I find interesting because a lot of war correspondents really stick to one theater of operations. During the war, Sherrod stayed in the Pacific during his whole time there. Of course, Pyle kind of concentrated on North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Northern Europe, and then at the end decides to go to the Pacific, where he's killed on Okinawa.
And that's an interesting point there, because you fact that Pyle did it the other way round. It was kind of North Africa and Europe first, then Pacific. You're hanging around with Marines a lot, or the Army personnel, and those who are watching who are veterans. There's a lot of kind of, not superstition, but there's a sense that your destiny's up, your numbers up. You see it in the war films that if you get. When you're watching a war film, if the guy is engaged to get married, he talks about it, he's going to get killed in the next scene. Those are tropes, I wonder whether he kind of thought that he'd ridden his luck in the Pacific theater, but there's perhaps a new category of luck he can kind of harvest by going to the ETO and kind of starting a new journey there and kind of leaving the Pacific behind. That may be it's in my head as kind of a challenge, moving away from one set of danger and starting again.
That could be. I think he's always someone who tried to be as safe as he could, but always in the back of his mind, he knew he was risking being killed or being seriously wounded. But he said, I'm risking that because I think there might be a good story in it. And that was the overriding thing that he always thought about, is this going to be a good story? And he always judged his assignments on that. And Sicily proved to be a good story. He was there following American troops, switched during the middle of the battle to follow the British Tommies of the 8th Army. And he's on this fascinating little amphibious operation. You had this great competition between Patton and Montgomery to be the first to capture Messina in Sicily. And so the British do this amphibious operation to try to get to Messina before Patton does. And he's there with an armored brigade and a commando unit. And they make their landing, they proceed toward Messina, and they're under fire from the Germans, and time is wasting. And so one of the commando leaders, Mad Jack Churchill, who's a famous commando from the British, decide, well, why not? Let's do this, reconnaissance and see if we can get to Messina. Be nice to capture it and get the mayor before anyone else. And so he, Tregaskis, and their driver climb into a jeep and set off toward Messina. A really dangerous mission because, as they find, the Germans had just, evacuated from the area just a few hours before they drove through a particular area. Unluckily for them, the Americans beat them into Messina, and Tregaskis looks across and he can see Italy from where he's at, and he realizes he's still in danger because the Germans start lobbing shells his way, and he tries to, escape from the scene. And luckily for him, a scout car pulls up, and in it were 3 British servicemen who he had met on one of the landing craft. And so they're able to get there and pull him out of danger. From, of course, the Sicily operation, he's there for the Salerno landings in September 1943, following the American army into Italy. Once again, he's in danger. He's with a jeep full of American correspondents, the first into Naples before American troops arrive there. They're mobbed by Italians from the city and barely escape back to get their stories written. Here's Tregaskis with Mark Clark, of course, the commander of the Fifth Army in Italy. And
he manages to make look short.
That's right. Yeah, Clark's 6'3", and here's Tregaskis towering over him. It's amazing. The first time I think Clark probably felt that during the war.
Yeah.
And in Italy, Tregaskis' luck finally runs out. He's going off to report on action involving Darby's Rangers in the Italian hillside. Are fighting almost hand-to-hand with their German opposition. He goes up to Mount Arno and thinks he has a good story. And on his way back to report on it, German shells land near him and pierce his helmet, and fragments lodge in his brain. And some of his best writing, I think, is in his second book, Invasion Diary, talking about his time in Sicily and Italy, talking about what happens to him while he's wounded, staggering down the hillside to get his wounds treated. And he's very severely wounded for a time. Here he is at the evacuation hospital for a time. He can't speak intelligently. He can't use his right arm. So he's stuck with this head wound in this hospital, and wondering what will happen to him if he'd be able to write again. And but through it, he decides to persevere, starts reading a book of poetry to get his speech back up to par. He's visited by a lot of other correspondents, including Ernie Pyle, who's in Italy at the same time he is. And of course, one of the aspects of Pyle is that if you're subject of one of his columns, is almost as good as winning a medal if you're a serviceman, because you get all that attention from the American public. But Pyle visits Tregaskis in his evacuation hospital, writes a column about it and what he experienced. And Pyle says, if I'd gone through what he had gone through, I'd be home. But, he does go home, but he decides to go back into action. He's operated on at Walter Reed Hospital. He has a metal plate put in his head. He keeps a sense of humor about what had been happening to him. He asks his doctors if by chance the metal was bulletproof, Unfortunately, it is not. So he has to deal with that. Finished his writing Invasion Diary. And once again, if I had done all he had, writing a bestseller, Invasion Diary is also on the bestseller charts for a time. I figured that I'd done all I could during the war and I would have stayed home. But goes back into action once again and is there for the Normandy breakout in Northern Europe, and is in Aachen for the terrible street fighting going on there with the 1st Infantry Division. Writes a great piece for Saturday Evening Post, one of the major magazines of the time, called House to House and Room to Room, about his experiences overseas, and finds that his nerves are a bit shaky, that what he had experienced finally had caught up with him, and he kind of lost some of his confidence and decides to return to the United States. But is very intrigued and influenced by his experience in Aachen and the courage of the infantry during that street fighting, and decides to write his first novel. He calls it Stronger Than Fear. It's a book based on experiences in Aachen, and he dedicated it to the honor and glory of the infantry. And it's a very slight book. Not very long, but it's very powerful. I think he takes that raw emotion he felt while he was under fire in Aachen and experiencing the intensity of street fighting, and puts it all into this book.
And do you think he went for the novel format because he could just crank it up a bit because it's fake names and things like that, whereas writing about real people, you've got to keep it on that level of what actually happened and what these people did, and the novel is a slightly more expansive format to go to town.
Mm-hmm. And I think the diary format of his previous 2 books really helped them become hits with the American public, because you get that immediacy. You're there day by day, and you can see what's happening in battle. You can see it from Tregaskis' own viewpoint as he's interacting with the troops on the front lines, behind the lines. He's interacting with civilians in Italy, and it's just really has that immediacy. It has that impact that you might not get from a regular nonfiction book.
And that incredible ability to be able to make comparisons. That your average person in combat, that you go through one theater of operations. I mean, some people transfer, but to have been on, in the fleet that the Doolittle Raiders left, and then you're in Guadalcanal, and then you're in Sicily, and then you're in Aachen, and then you've seen it from all different angles. You've been with the Navy, you've been with the Marines, you've been with the Army. It means that when you're experiencing that street fighting in Aachen, unlike the other GIs who are there who can't really compare it to Guadalcanal, he can make that. Well, this is how urban fighting is different to jungle fighting. This is how it's different now. We're fighting enemy on their homeland compared to Guadalcanal. That's the kind of unique ability that someone who's traveled so extensively can bring to something.
He always had this hunger for new experiences. You talked about, he's traveling on a ship, he's in the jungle, he's in street fighting. While he's in Europe, he flies as an observer on a P-38 fighter, and they come under attack from German fighters. He travels on bombing missions, and that comes into what he does next during the war. He transfers from the International News Service and starts writing for the Saturday Evening Post. And they decide that they want him to do a series called The Road to Tokyo, go back to the Pacific. And they even ask him when they're talking about the idea for this series he's going to do, do you really want to go? And he says, I don't want to go, but I think I have to go. And I think that's in the whole spirit of his time in World War II, is that I have to go. I have to go and report on what was going on.
And again, just to interrupt you, people are going to criticize me for jumping in too much, but that is because he's walked away from combat men who are still in combat there. He's had that ability. He's now committed. He's got to be true to them. They can't walk away. He can't walk away. And it strikes me that he's kind of made this inner promise that, he's going to keep at it till the bitter end. Otherwise, he's kind of somehow disrespecting those people who opened up to him back in 42, back in 43.
He always wants to be their voice, I think, and report on their experiences and reflect, the sacrifices that they're making. So he accompanies this new B-29 crew, B-29 Super Fortress number 688, from their training base in Kansas overseas until finally they land on Guam, and he accompanies them on 5 bombing missions over the next several months, when he's there in August 1945 for the end of the war in the Pacific. Reports on it from landing in Guam to their first few missions, and really reports on a new aspect of warfare with this super modern, super advanced bomber that the American military has invented, and its achievements against Japan. While he's on those missions in Guam, he hears about carrier strikes against the Japanese home islands from a carrier task force and decides to go back on a carrier. He's on the USS Ticonderoga for missions against the Curie naval base in Japan. And he flies on an Avenger bomber from the Ticonderoga with this pilot, Paul Stevens. And, he's in the plane as they attack Japanese ships that are anchored at the Curie naval base. Feels all those tensions of combat, and another new experience for him. And once again, has a close call. They're successful on this mission, return to the carrier, fine. And he decides to, instead of going on another mission, to relax for a few days. And the next time Stevens goes out with his crewmen, he never comes back. His plane goes down and he is killed. So it's one of the interesting aspects we talked about earlier about if you're a war correspondent in your far-flung locales, you never know the impact of your stories maybe until months or weeks later. And sometimes your stories never even see print. And one of the things I found in doing research on Tregaskis is some of his best writing comes from his time on the Ticonderoga, and the feelings he gets losing this guy who he come to know so well, and been in the crucible of combat with him. And he writes very eloquently about it. But by the time he's ready to have these stories printed in the Saturday Evening Post, the atomic bombs are dropped, the war in Japan is over, and he's overtaken by events. And these articles are never published in the Saturday Evening Post, which I think is unfortunate, but I was able to at least get them in print in my book about him. There's one of the photos from the Curie mission that Tregaskis was on. And he goes to Japan for the occupation, reports on the development of the civilian government there. He's there with MacArthur and trying to, bring democracy to Japan. Returns to the United States, continues to write for the Saturday Evening Post, continues to be concerned with how veterans are, how they doing now as civilians, and write a series of articles on various veterans and their experiences coming back. He follows Poppy Hand, who was the pilot of the B-29 bomber he was on, returning to his family's walnut farm in California. A bombardier who decides he wants to, instead of destroying cities, design new cities, and seeing how they're getting on with their lives after this great conflict. And Tregaskis never seemed to be able to keep away from war for too long. He has the opportunity to go to Korea as a war correspondent, doesn't take it because he's having difficulty with his diabetes, does go to Korea near the end of the war there to do a documentary film about the not the U.S. troops, but the troops from other nations who contributed forces to Korea. But when American troops are sent as advisors early on in the early 1960s to Vietnam. He goes there once again, and as he did in World War II, embeds himself with the American advisors, flies combat missions, flies helicopter missions on the ground. And as you can see, he carries his old, there's that in the bottom left there, you can see that big notebook he carried with him everywhere, jotting down
let go
information.
of this time.
Never let go of this
last time. Yeah, keeps it firmly in his hand. Yeah.
That's right. And he found happiness late in life with his third wife, Moana Tregaskis, who he helped train as a war correspondent. She accompanied him on many of his trips over to Vietnam. He went there for many, many times from the 1960s to the 1970s during our involvement there. Wrote a book, Vietnam Diary, that looked at our early involvement in Vietnam. And he died in 1973. One of the things he did as a hobby often, of course, was from his days at Harvard, was swimming. He loved taking long swims in the ocean. He was on one of these, he lived in Honolulu, Hawaii, and on one of these long swims has a heart attack and drowns and and dies. And here's Moana scattering his ashes off of the beach at Waikiki in 1973.
Wow.
Just age 56, I think he is. Yes, 50s, in his 50s. Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing. And thank you for the presentation. But that 73, you dying in that year, you haven't really seen the full Vietnam fallout. I mean, obviously that it had begun, but the era after the pulling out is when things really kind of turned, and we know we're not going to go down the phases of how American veterans have been treated, though it did come up in the sidebar about veterans hospitals. Right. But if he'd lived longer, I wonder whether he'd have looked back and kind of been a bit more cynical about the role of journalists and what he'd done, because the World War II it will always be that pure war. We always look at it in that the enemy were truly evil. We had to overcome them, and the wars since aren't the same ilk. So when you going through his writing, even when he was there in the early stages of Vietnam, had he changed? Was he seeing things differently? Was he more cynical?
He was not cynical at all. I think he was a true believer in the American helping out the South Vietnamese against North Vietnam. He was someone who really thought for a long time he had seen China as a threat in that area of the country. He believed in the domino theory that, Vietnam fell, all these other countries would fall as well. He's someone who always believed in the bravery and courage of American fighting men. And that comes through in his book on Vietnam Diary. He's very impressed by these advisors who are professional men who are not draftees of the later period of our involvement. These are, true professionals who are advising the South Vietnamese forces. Those are quite different from, I think, the forces that come later. And he gets into conflict with some of the younger correspondents who were sent to Vietnam, David Halberstam, Malcolm Brown, Neil Sheehan. But Halberstam in particular had seen Tregaskis as a hero from his World War II reporting, and takes him with him, around and introduces him to sources. But Tregaskis is not impressed. He said, if I was doing what you're doing in this war, I'd be ashamed of myself. And there's a schism between the old breed and the new breed of correspondents who are more willing to question what's going on. Of course, it's a different kind of war. In World War II, the battle lines were fixed. You knew where the war was, where the front line was. And in Vietnam, the war could be anywhere. And I think the correspondents of Vietnam were more willing to question some of the policies that were going on. If American support was really winning the tide during the war,
definitely.
Should we support them and all that?
The Vietnam War is beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about on this channel, and it's a never-ending discussion that won't go away. But we had a couple of questions earlier on about any awards he received from, because we know that the diary and the book, the movies became popular with the public, but for a journalist, a correspondent, you kind of want that peer recognition as well. So did he win any awards for his writing?
He was honored by the INS for his reporting from Guadalcanal. They had a regular yearly award called the George Holmes Award for the best reporting by a foreign correspondent. He won that. That's one of the reasons why he was returning home in 1943 after Guadalcanal to get the award. He wasn't able to make it back in time. His wife accepted it for him. Later on, his book on Vietnam received some prizes from the Overseas Press Club. It's comprised of foreign correspondents, and it was honored for its achievements. But he never, like Pyle, won the Pulitzer Prize, for example, for reporting as Pyle did. But he was someone whose work was respected by other correspondents, someone whose dispatches were thought of highly by his peers, but never got those big prizes.
Yeah, and maybe this is a tough question, given that you obviously appreciate the people you write about. But when people have asked me and known me about Ernie Pyle's writing, I said, well, it endures because he wasn't trying to be anything beyond what he was. And I think of Hemingway was famously on D-Day, and he was in his very kind of flowery, trying to make all these literary statements. And I find his 44 stuff, Hemingway, a little bit kind of bleh. But Pyle was just telling it like it was and wasn't trying to use big words, because he was trying to just have the GIs read it. And where do you think Tregaskis sits in terms of, now we're 8 decades on from when he wrote Guadalcanal Diary? Is his work readable? Is it relative to a modern audience? I mean, obviously your book is definitely readable, but his original reports, where does it sit now in a 2022 kind of aspect?
I think both of his books from World War II are highly readable today. They're classics for a reason. Guadalcanal Diary endures for a reason. It's still in print. Invasion Diary as well has been reprinted. It really captures the experience of combat that a lot of books don't do. And I really like Invasion Diary myself, because I think it's some of the best writing about what it's like to be wounded, and the whole aspect of it, from the first shock of being wounded, the ups and downs of your recovery, trying to come to grips with what's happened to your body when you're stuck at a hospital, seeing other men wounded, some more severely than you are, counting your lucky stars. At least, I have all my faculties eventually, as Tregaskis did, while other men lost their arms, lost their sight, or received head wounds much more severe, and they would never come back from it. And so I really like Invasion Diary. I think his writing is spot on. His descriptions of the combat are great, and are step up even, I think, from Guadalcanal Diary. I don't think that's a common opinion. I think most people prefer Guadalcanal Diary for its immediacy and its ability to capture, an aspect of World War II that had never been reported on until his book came out.
And I have to say, I haven't read his other works. I will go and seek them out now. But it's interesting as well that, when we talk about the film, because someone said, what did he think of the film version? Do we know what he thought when he first saw the film? Would it have been on a rerun 20 years later, or did he get to see it during the war?
I didn't get anything from his actually seeing the film. He was very disappointed in not being able to be involved with the film,
the making of it,
because he was overseas, and he thought, well, maybe I'll have a chance. He'd always wanted to be in Hollywood, and that's something he did after the war. He wrote a few Hollywood scripts and worked for a variety of film studios. So he thought, well, this is my opportunity. And he missed out on that chance because he couldn't get back in time. So he was a little upset by that. And that might have, I think, colored his opinion of what the film was when it did come out.
But because to me, the film and the book, they set up some of the things we now consider cliches. The film, particularly with the Brooklyn cabbie and the Iowa farmer, and that then became the trope.
Melting pot that comes together and
that became the trope that went all through the 50s and all those movies, the Battle Cry and the Sands of Iwo Jima and the Battleground, all had those, there's the farmer, there's the Texas guy with the guitar, and the British, we had the same, we had the Cockney and the vicar's son and things like that. So when you read those books now, sometimes it's difficult to remember that something had to start that off. And to me, Guadalcanal Diary kind of is one of those ones that started that idea of talking about individuals, not and what happened to individuals, not necessarily the flow of battle and what the objectives were the objectives seized, but what were the experiences of the men in combat that we take for granted now, that we want to know what people were feeling emotionally. But that was kind of novel back then. But anyway, we're in danger of going off down a rabbit hole now. But what are you working on? Obviously, this is your latest work. What are you working on next? Is there another World War II project in the offing?
No, this one is a kind of a springboard from my work on Tregaskis. I was fascinated by his time in Vietnam and his interactions with these young correspondents. So I thought, well, I should take a look at what they were doing in Vietnam. And so I'm doing a book on Malcolm Brown, who was the AP bureau chief in Saigon or in the early 1960s. And when you think of Vietnam, you think of some iconic photographs. You think of the Tet Offensive photograph of the suspected Viet Cong guerrilla being shot in the head. You think of the poor young girl who's naked running down the street from the napalm attack. And the third one you usually think of is the Buddhist priest who's doused himself with gasoline and set himself with fire to protest treatment by the government of the Buddhists. And Malcolm Brown was the guy who shot that photograph, was there during the demonstration, captured the event on film. So I'm kind of taking a look at how he came to be there to capture that photograph, his early time in the 1960s in Saigon with the other young war correspondents, how the pressures they had in reporting on American involvement there with the Kennedy administration, the Diem government, and all what was going on in Vietnam. And he was someone, Malcolm Brown, who not only was there at the beginning, but was also there at the end of the war. He's reporting from Saigon as North Vietnam is sweeping south, capturing the country, and lifted up a helicopter from the American embassy and was there for the very end of the war.
Well, see, now you got me intrigued by that one. Now, I don't read very much about Vietnam because I just haven't got the time, but that sounds really intriguing. I think of Vietnam very much as a kind of a visual reporting, whereas World War II, I know we had the newsreels still being the written word being so important, and radio, but Vietnam and me as a kid, the Falklands when I was 12, that's 40 years ago this year, that it was about the images you're seeing rather than the reporting. But
one of the great things about doing, the early days of our involvement is that the words were important, because the TV had not yet, been over to Vietnam as they were later on. They became much more important than the written word. But during the early days with Halberstam, Brown, and Sheehan, those reports and papers like the New York Times, really upset the Kennedy government. And there was a lot of some bad feelings. So the words were actually important during our early involvement in the war.
Well, I'm now looking forward to that one now. So, we'll bring things to end. It's been an amazing presentation. I'll just remind folks what we've got coming up tomorrow. So don't go. I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So, folks, tomorrow's show, it's important. It starts later. So it's 9 p.m. GMT. We start because of Henry Sledge, Eugene's son, is going to come back from work. So a later one for me, 10 p.m. my time, 9 p.m. GMT. That's where Henry's going to be telling about retracing his father's steps across Peleliu. In the end, we didn't get the video footage for it. We've got lots of great photos for it. That'll be an amazing show. Then Thursday, we're going out of the Pacific to talk about the airborne operation into Trigueño Aqueduct in 1942. And then Friday, we're back in the Pacific again with Steve McLeod to talk about the battle on Saipan. Our first time we've tackled Saipan on this channel. So I'm looking forward to that one. And then next week, it all carries on with Special Forces. So as usual, folks, don't forget to share what we're doing on social media. Consider becoming a member of the channel or a patron. The link to Ray's book is in the description below, or you can find it at your local bookstore or whatever online shop you go to. That's all in information. Now, I urge you to go there because this is someone who saw the war from multiple angles. So I think it's going to be a real cracking read. So there you are. Don't forget to go and get that. But right now, thank you very much, Ray, for talking to us. Did you enjoy it?
I did very much. It's a great show. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to further episodes.
Yeah, and maybe you can come back on and talk about one of the other correspondents. That would be fantastic. Yeah. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. So this is Paul Woodhouse from World War II TV saying I will see you all again tomorrow evening, but don't forget 2 hours later. Cheers, everybody. Have a good one. Bye.